I recently looked at over 523 suburbs in Melbourne, and before I did that research, I had this opinion that it was super expensive and way out of the league of people with budgets in the $400,000 to $800,000 range. But after looking at these suburbs, I almost fell off my seat because there is incredible value down there in Melbourne right now. Which is why in this video, I'm going to explain 10 reasons why Melbourne looks insane in 2025 to 2032. Now, the number one reason is just me being such a data geek and me absolutely loving this stuff, and that is the history. Now, when we look at the history between Sydney and Melbourne, obviously Sydney has always been a little bit higher. In fact, in the last 30 years, Sydney has averaged about 29% higher on the average house price than Melbourne. But according to a recent article in the Australian Financial Review, Sydney is now over 60 to 65% higher than the average property in Melbourne, which is the largest gap between the two cities in the last 30 years. Now, the second reason I love Melbourne at the moment is the longer term history. When I looked at some data from CoreLogic over the last 50 years between the period of 1970 until now, I found that when you looked at the total return divided by all the years, Melbourne had averaged about 9.5% per annum, which says to me that even though we've gone through incredibly traumatic and intense things like the recession we had to have, 19% interest rates in the 80s, COVID, the global financial crisis, Melbourne, even through all those bumps and bruises, wars, and crazy political events, Melbourne has been extremely stable and performed really well longer term. Now, the third reason that I love Melbourne at the moment is so many people writ it off after COVID. Because 200,000 or 300,000 people bailed the city, including the students and the people that moved back overseas or to other places like Queensland or Perth in Australia. And on top of that, you add the instability with all the politics down there over that period of time, things like increasing stamp duty and land tax, and then everybody that left the state, and you end up with this perfect storm where people for some reason have put Melbourne in this it's a bad place to buy and it's an even worse place to invest category, versus looking at the longer term history, which I just mentioned in point 2. Now, what's significant to me is when we look at the Australian government bringing over 500,000 people into Australia per year at the moment, about 160,000 of those people are finding their way into Melbourne. Now, while the average Australian might have thought the entire Melbourne market was super expensive, these people coming in from overseas, the doctors, the lawyers, the nurses, the engineers, and the IT professionals that are coming in with incredible skills and earning 150 to 300k per household are sliding into Melbourne and picking up these 400 to 800k homes every day of the week right now. Now, the fourth reason and the most important reason for me as a homeowner and an investor is Melbourne is cheap as right now. Now, like I said before, when I'd looked at Melbourne, I'd kind of put it recently in that Sydney box, which is just too expensive. It's completely overpriced. There's property selling in Portsea or Sorrento for 10 million bucks right now. East Melbourne, you need $1 to $3 million to buy anything. The Mornington Peninsula's gone crazy, Geelong's gone crazy, and therefore I just wrapped it up in this beautiful little present, which is Melbourne is off my radar right now. But after painstakingly going through over 500 suburbs recently and really looking deeply into Melbourne, what I found is that there's incredible value, particularly in North, Northwest, and West Melbourne right now. In fact, there's properties in those markets, houses on 600 square meter blocks that I've seen recently sell between 320k and 700k that look incredible statistically and have great long-term value. Now, if you go to our YouTube page, you'll actually be able to see me do videos where I walk through some of the most undervalued and best suburbs in Melbourne at the moment, and you can see me walking through examples of properties in this price range which have sold in the last couple of months for absolutely nothing when you compare them to the likes of Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Canberra, and even Hobart. It's phenomenal the value down there right now. Now, the fifth thing that I like about Melbourne right now is vacancy rates. Now, I've been tracking these month on month since about 2017, and what I've seen is vacancy rates in the city, when they completely oversupplied it with units, go all the way up to about 5 to 6%, and progressively, particularly in the last 18 months, come down to below 2%. Now, vacancy rates below 2% signify to me that a market is undersupplied with available property for rent. On top of that, many of these quality suburbs in East, North and West Melbourne right now have had vacancy rates just go below 1%. Now, based on the last 30 years of data from CBA Bank and CoreLogic, when vacancy rates go below 1%, we normally see rents rise in the city by at least $100 per week, and prices begin to jump as well as people get the shits with renting and looking for rental properties and go to buy. I believe what we're going to see at the moment is still an oversupply of inner city units in Melbourne, which we saw in COVID. Once the students and the internationals leave the city, just end up vacant. But if you go a little bit further out, sort of 8 to about 30 k's from the city, we haven't been building enough property in Melbourne for the last 5 years. So many people have been coming back into the country or from overseas to live there, and it's resulting in a chronic undersupply of property in Melbourne, which we'll start hearing about in the media over the next couple of years. Now, the sixth reason I love Melbourne is people earn great cash down there. In fact, according to the ABS, as of right now in the latest census, the average household is earning over $1,900 per week, which is over $95,000 per year. What's even more important is there's bands and bands of people, in fact a significant part of the Melbourne population, that are earning well over the 150 to 300k bracket. Now, what I've seen previously from buying a lot of property in Sydney and Brisbane or Southeast Queensland in particular, as incomes rise and property prices go stable, we see not just potential for price growth but true price growth because people can afford to buy it. Now, if you put yourself in the shoes of these 160,000 people that are cashed up coming into Melbourne per year from all over the world, imagine you're earning $300,000 per year and you can slip into a beautiful 12-year-old brand new 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2-car garage home on 800 square meters of land, 20 k's from the city for under 700k. When your average household income can pay off a property in a 3 or 4 year period, that is extreme for affordability, and the marketplace isn't silly. It will begin to price those properties up over time. Now, the seventh reason I love Melbourne is when I look at 10-year growth rates, and I think if there's one silver bullet in the Australian property industry that I've found from doing this for the last 15 years, it's comparing long-term price growth, which, as we know based on the data from CoreLogic, has been about 9.5% per annum in Melbourne over the last 50 years, versus 10-year growth rates. We can get a true indication of whether a market is overvalued or undervalued at the moment. Now, what's interesting about Melbourne is it went through phenomenal price growth between 2014 and 2018. In fact, many of those years were 10 to 20% growth. But since that period, it has sat relatively flat, and in the last 5 years actually come backwards. Now, that's resulted in certain suburbs in Melbourne, when I look at the 523 suburbs across the city, some of them being extremely overvalued in East Melbourne, for example, and some of them being completely undervalued in North and West Melbourne. In fact, I've been able to find over 60 suburbs in the city right now, and 18 of them look absolutely phenomenal for investment that have done less than 5% per annum over the last 10 years, which says to me that those suburbs, statistically speaking, in the last 10 years have done about 50% less than they should have based on history, which is when I like to buy. Now, the eighth reason I love Melbourne is just the hype. When you look at it globally, it is ranked as the #1 student city in the world and the 4th most livable city behind the likes of Vienna and those sorts of cities around the world right now. In fact, in the last 10 years, I think there's been 2 occasions where it's been either #1 or 2 as the most livable cities globally. On top of that, despite everybody hating on Melbourne right now, in terms of Australians and how we feel about our cities, it is still ranked #1 in terms of livability in Australia right now, and I can see why. When people are earning great money and rents and house prices are super cheap because nothing's really happened in the last 8 years, it makes us feel better because we've got extra money to spend on our lifestyles. Now, the 9th reason that I love Melbourne, it's got a history of weathering really bad financial environments. In fact, when we look at the last 60 years and we look at the 3 worst financial events over that particular period of time, like the end of cycle decline stuff where you hear about the American market going through a GFC, stocks declining by 30 to 70%, and houses in America going down 35 to 40%. The average of those 3 worst environments, the decline in Melbourne has only been 8%, according to the great Phil Anderson, who wrote The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. For all of you who love history and data and understanding what's happened around the world and what might happen in the future, it's a great read. Now, on top of this, when I went back and looked at arguably the worst financial environment we've been through since the Great Depression, which was the last GFC, During that period between 2007 and 2012, Melbourne actually increased by 47%. Now, the next top performing market that I looked at was Brisbane, that did during that time 31%, and then Perth and Sydney during that same period of time only did 20%. So I love that Melbourne went through that really, really bad environment in a positive way. And if we're getting closer to the top of the cycle now, then Melbourne, because it's so affordable right now and people are earning so much money, is really, really well poised to do great returns over the next 10 to 15 years. Now, the 10th and final reason I love Melbourne at the moment is the diversity of property available for homeowners and investors in the city right now. Whether you're looking for the most beautiful homes in Australia or around the world in the likes of Portsea, the Mornington Peninsula or Sorrento, and you want to spend 3 to 5 million or 10 million bucks, there's something there for those international or Australian ballers that are looking for that absolute beautiful stuff. But then you can step back into the likes of East Melbourne, which has incredible suburbs and beautiful infrastructure and brand names, and pick up something really, really decent with great long-term potential for that $1 to $3 million mark. And then if, like me, you don't have the money to go out there and do either of those things right now, nor do you have the desire to, in the likes of North Melbourne, you can still buy properties 8 to 12 k's from the city for well below $1 million bucks. Or if you're prepared to go a little bit further up the road, you can get great properties sort of 15 to 30 k's in the city for 600 to 800k right now. And if those budgets still feel too high, then you can slide out into North or West Melbourne and pick up properties there for literally between 300 and 600k right now. Now, my thoughts or predictions for the future of Melbourne is it's going to be a slow burn over the next few years, and just as it starts picking up, we might be in a financial environment not dissimilar to the last GFC. But I think what I've learned from studying the Melbourne market and beginning to buy properties there over the last 12 months is it's an extremely resilient market that is very, very cheap right now, with great fundamentals in terms of long-term averages, 10-year averages, incomes, and vacancy rates. I think this city is going to be one that's completely missed in the next few years because of the likes of Brisbane, South Australia or Adelaide and Perth continuing to do somewhere between 6 and 20% per year as interest rates begin to come down. The likes of Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth, according to SQM, continuing to do phenomenal growth. And like always, as investors, most people are going to chase the shiny thing, the thing that's working right now, the thing that did really well last year. And a lot of people are going to miss out on the bottom of the Melbourne market. Now, for you as one of the small number of people who know about this now, can begin to do your own research, start to get your head around that market, can start to follow some of the other videos that we've done around the Melbourne market, and hopefully you can enter that with confidence and safety at the bottom of a 10-year low and have an incredible experience over the next 15 years as you set yourself or your family up for long-term financial freedom. G'day guys, my name's Ben and I'm the director here at Pumped on Property, and I just want to say a massive thank you for watching our content today. Now, if you're thinking about buying an investment property in the next 3 to 12 months, then the team and I would love to offer you a one-on-one strategy session. In that session, we can talk about exactly where you are right now, where you'd like to be longer term, and we can deeply educate you on the Australian market. And then you can take that information and go and absolutely smash it on your own, or potentially become one of the small number of clients that we work with each week. To book your session, all you have to do is go to www.pumpedonproperty.com and click that book your free strategy session button. But either way, we wish you all the best on your journey as an investor to financial freedom.